Hello everybody, welcome to my class of business strategy. My name is Sang-Hwa Lee. I'm the professor of Handong Global University at the School of Global Entrepreneurship and ICT. Today I want to talk about gap analysis and BC and logic tree with the BCG matrix. Okay, as you have seen this chart a couple of times, this is the 5-step process for building business strategy. The first step of building the business strategy is identifying the gap between the current performance and the target level. And then, in order to get rid of this gap, we list a lot of strategic alternatives first. And then we analyze external and internal factors to evaluate which strategic alternatives are better than the others. And after analysis, we choose the best strategic option, and if we build and implement the action plan, that's something we are doing for building the business strategies. So in those 5 steps, the first step is gap analysis. So during the class of the number 5, I want to cover both step number 1 and 2, doing the gap analysis and BC and issue tree analysis with BCG matrix. The start of the strategy development always begins with a gap identification between target and performance. Some of you may have noticed that you have seen this chart before. In my class number 2, while I explaining the overview of the problem-solving 7 steps, I emphasize that defining the problem is the first step to solve the problem. So what is the problem? Problem can be defined as the gap, as the phenomenon or the situation where there is a gap. And the gap is defined as simply the differences between target and performance. So the start of the strategy development, simply like the problem-solving process, always begins with a gap identification between target and performance. If I explain it a little bit again to recall your memory, this is to think about strategic initiatives in 2 years from 2018 to 2020. The current performance at 2018, the earnings before interest and taxes is assumed to be 100 units. So, and then if we do not implement some dramatic strategy, our earnings before interest and taxes in 2020 is expected to be 95. What are the external factors influencing the 5% decrease of the Ebitd numbers? One is price cost squeeze. So external environment is not favorable to our company. Maybe the price could be lower than today, but the cost would be higher than today in 2 years. So our margin will be shrinking by 7%. So even though we do our best for the organic growth, that will increase only 2% of our earnings. So in total, without any dramatic strategic effort, our EBIT numbers in 2 years are expected to be 95. But we set our EBIT target in 2020 as high as 195. So the gap we have to fill out is the gap to be closed is 100. That is 195 minus 95. That is the difference between target EBIT number and as is EBIT number in 2020. So once the gap is identified, and then we have to think about a lot of different options and conduct extensive analysis to determine which option is better than the other, and then choose one of the best options. That's the building the business strategy to achieve the target EBIT number in 2020 of 190 units, 195 units. Okay. So as I have explained before, gap means simply the difference between the desired target and the current performance. So the reason why we set the the strategy is to achieve the desired target. But at the same time, we have to consider the current performance of ours. So the gap is the difference between the target and the performance. Once we identify the gap, we will do our best to build the business strategies and to achieve the target numbers. So gap is target minus performance. So when I have emphasized in problem solving process, try to be very specific to explain the targets. So I'd recommend you to explain the gaps in quantitatively rather than qualitatively. So rather than saying simply, I want to increase my gross margin, you may say that I want to increase my gross margin by 5% point from 15% to 20%. Or I want to increase my sales volume by 100 million won in 5 years. Or I want to lose my weight by 20 kilograms in 6 months. So that is a better explain the description of the gap we will close. So in case the gap between the target and the performance is big, consider the more aggressive strategy. So this slide shows that when the gap is big, that means the goal is high, but our performance level is low. And then you have to consider aggressive strategy. When we pursue the aggressive strategy, there will be more risk of failure at the same time. But the strategy is something we are pursuing effectively and efficiently to achieve the target goals. So to achieve the stretched goal, the aggressive strategy should be the best option we may pursue. On the other hand, if the gap is small, that means if the goal is not relatively high, but our performance at the current level is high, that means the gap is very small, and then we may choose passive strategy or mild strategy without taking a big risk. So strategy is dependent on the size of the gap, and then the size of the gap is a function of two driving factors. One is the level of the target, and then the second driving force is the current performance level, right? So this is the big gap case. So what is the gap between my target and the current performance? So for example, how much is my sales target this year? All the salesmen have their own sales target for a specific year. And in this example, my sales target for this year is 100 billion won. We have no idea whether this target is high or low, but by comparing this target level with the past year's target or with the past year's performance, we may assume whether this target number is high or not. So this is the target. And the next question is about the current performance. How much is my current performance this year? As of the end of June 2020, let's assume that my sales are 30 billion won. That means the target achievement rate is only 30%. So as I said, gap is the difference between the target and performance. So the gap is 70 billion won. So how big is the gap between the sales goals and current performance? In order to achieve 100% of its goals, I need to make 70 billion won in sales for the remaining 6 months. So in this case, where the gap is big, when assessing a lot of options to pursue, it's better for this salesman to choose the aggressive strategy in order to close the gap. Okay, so this is the case where the gap is so big. There's another case where the gap is so small. What is the gap between the target and the current performance? In this case, how much is my sales target this year? My sales target for this year is 100 billion won. So it's the same as the big gap case in the previous slide. But if you look at the current performance of this year, my current sales numbers are 70 billion won as of the end of the June 2020. So my performance is higher than the previous case, where my sales numbers are only 30 billion won. So in this small gap case, my performance is great, so the target achievement rate is 70%. So how much is the gap between sales goals and current performance? In order to achieve 100% of its goal, I need to make only 30 billion won in sales for the remaining 6 months. So I'd rather take the passive strategy or mild strategy instead of choosing the aggressive strategies. So if we consider those two cases, big gap case and small gap case, the target numbers are the same, but the current performance level is different. So a lot of experts are saying the strategy is something we have to pursue to achieve the targets. But it also, the current level performance is affecting, influencing the choice of the strategies a lot. So this is the exercise case. So I have shown two cases where the gap is big and another case where the gap is small. So my questions are the same as we have seen in previous slides. What is the gap between my target and the current performance? How much is my desired target? How much is my current performance? And how big is the gap between my target and the current performance? So this is the first step to build the business strategy, to think about the gap between your desired target and your current performance. You don't have to think about the sales target numbers like in this case.